Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your attendance this evening. Well, as the chairman mentioned, this evening we'll look at the Bible's record of the Tower of Babel. Last week we considered Noah's flood, which was described in Genesis 6 through to chapters 9. And this evening we'll look at the Tower of Babel, which occurs a couple of chapters later in Genesis chapter 11. And from a cursory reading, the story of the Tower of Babel appears quite a simple one. Only 9 verses are dedicated to this event. And yet in these 9 verses, there's irony, there's repetition, there's rhetoric, there's figure of speech, and there's poetic justice. But it almost seems too simple. A group of people decide to build a tower to reach heaven, but it doesn't end too well for them because God responds by confusing their language and scattering these people across the face of the earth. And from a cursory reading, that appears to be the whole story. Or so it appears, because this tower and the apparent origin of language and nations has both mystified and fascinated historians, archaeologists, and linguists the world over. So why do we need to look at this Tower of Babel? Well, I'm going to put it to you that the importance of this event is one that had worldwide influence. It changed the course of world history forever. Because this tower not only explains the origin of nations and languages, it also sets a scene for the rest of the Bible. The themes that originate here in Genesis 11, they're going to continue right through the rest of Scripture to the final book of the Bible. The characters and the places that are mentioned here in Genesis 11, they're going to be repeated throughout Scripture. And so if we want to understand all of that, then we have to understand this story of the Tower of Babel. We have to learn the lesson from the past. And so this evening I'm going to assume that you have at least a basic understanding of the Bible. Because tonight I just want to give you an overview, the big picture of how this Tower of Babel fits in with the rest of Scripture. So I want you to come back, if you will, to Genesis chapter 6, just to remind ourselves of why God found it necessary to flood the earth. We're told the reason why in Genesis 6 and verse 5. God saw the wickedness of man. It was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Verse 7. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I've created, from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. So this is a description of society before the flood. And because of that, God decides to start again. Now, if that was the state of the earth before the flood, notice what happens after the flood when the Tower of Babel was built by these people. You notice in verse 6, we're told there's mighty men of old, men of renown. Well, it just so happens that by the time we get to Genesis 10, we're introduced to a man who's described as a mighty one in the earth. In Genesis 6, the earth was corrupt before God. Once again, in Genesis 10, we have a man who's described as a mighty hunter before the Lord. And as God looked down at the earth in Genesis 6, he saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Well, it's no different by the time we get to Genesis 11. We're told that God looks down and he says, this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. It's the same story, just repeated again 400 years later. But the outcome is slightly different. In Genesis 6, God floods the earth, but at the same time, he's going to choose a man named Noah to further his purpose. Well, in Genesis 11, God doesn't flood the earth. Instead, he chooses to stop their progress by dividing their language, and he'll scatter them across the earth. But once again, in the same chapter, he'll also choose a man named Abraham to further his purpose. So do you think the lesson of Noah's flood was learnt? Well, I don't think so, The lesson from history in Noah's flood was not learnt, and God has to intervene now for the second time in just 400 years. So if you come back to Genesis 11, we read in verse 1 that the world was of one language and of one speech. So unlike our world today, everyone spoke the same language at this time. But if you look at verse 6, the record implies that these people had more than just a shared language. Verse 6, the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language." So the emphasis here is not so much that they were of one language. Yes, that was true, but the emphasis here is that the people were one. That was the real issue, and that was what God saw. They were one in purpose. They were united in ambition. They had one ideal. And by the way, that wasn't a good thing, as we'll see over the course of this evening. And then we read in verse 2, "It came to pass as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there." Now just come back a few pages to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis 9 is set directly in the days following the flood. Now I want you to notice what God says to Noah and to his family, because he gives them in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 1 a specific command. He says this, "God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." So there's a command here to replenish the earth. That word means to fill the earth. And so what we're being told here is that God wanted Noah and his sons to fill and to scatter across the earth, to replenish the earth because of the destruction of the flood. But by the time we get to Genesis 11 and verse 2, what do we find? But as they journeyed from the east, they found this plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And what's more, in verse 4, they decide to really settle down, and they build a city, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Can you see the contrast here? God wanted man to fill the earth, to scatter across the earth. But these people don't want to do that. And so they decide to get real comfortable and settle in this land of Shinar, lest they be scattered across the earth, they say. They didn't want to fill the earth with God's glory as God intended. They wanted to dwell in cities which they had built themselves. So if you look at a map, you can see they've travelled from the mountains of Ararat, which is where Noah's Ark rested, and they've migrated towards the Persian Gulf. And they've come to this land of Shinar. And if you put this in modern terms, this land of Shinar corresponds to modern-day Iraq. But in ancient times, it was known as the Fertile Crescent. It was in the plains of Mesopotamia. It was situated between the river Tigris and the river Euphrates. Now we also know the name of this city that they would build, because we're told the name in verse 9. Therefore the name of that city was called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. Now the irony of that statement is in the meaning of that name Babel. Because in the Hebrew, it means to confound or to confuse, which is ironic because that's exactly what God did. He confused their language. And so this story is bookended with poetic justice. In verse 1, they arrive at this land of Shinar with big ideas, with unity, speaking one language. But in verse 9, they leave in disunity, and they leave with a multitude of languages. And so this place is called Babel, because of their confusion. And then we read in verse 3, they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. So they've invented this new means of construction. They've used fired bricks and bitumen to build this city, this tower. And of course they start by building their own houses. They build this city. But then they move on, wanting to build a tower. A tower in verse 4, whose top may reach unto heaven, as it said there, to the very dwelling place of God. And so what we find is that what began with a sense of unity in verse 1 Well, that results with an act of defiance by the time we get to verse 4. Now, I don't think these people were particularly naive in disregarding basic physics, thinking they could reach to heaven itself. This is a figure of speech used elsewhere in the Bible. It's a symbol of their rebellion and their arrogance towards the God of heaven. This is an act of defiance, no less. And so from a sense of unity, which results in an act of defiance, this now leads to a boast. Let us make us a name. You can't miss the humanistic element in these verses. It's all about us. Verse 3, let us make brick. Verse 4, let us build us a city. And in case you haven't got the point, they now say, let us make us a name. And so they make this proud boast. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to be known as the people that have built this tower in opposition to the so-called God of heaven. Now, to really understand the meaning behind this boast, I want to read you an ancient Jewish commentary on this Tower of Babel. This is what they say. God has no right to choose the upper world for himself and to leave the lower world to us. Therefore, we'll build us a tower with an idol on the top, holding a sword, so that it may appear as if it intends to war with God himself. So this is in direct opposition to God. And once we understand this, we suddenly realize this is a story about two opposing sides. It's a story about ambition. It's a story about human achievement. And at its heart, it's a story about human pride. Well, of course, all of this covers an underlying fear and resentment. Notice what it says there in the end of verse 4, lest we be scattered upon the face of the whole earth. They saw this as a very real threat to them, and they resented that God could, if he chose, choose to flood the earth or to scatter them across the face of the earth. And so perhaps they thought that if there was another flood, sometime in the future, then this tower would be their safeguard. They could retreat to this tower. They could ascend this tower and they could be safe from those floodwaters. They would be safe from God's judgment. That was their reasoning. Or perhaps I could say that was the reasoning of one man in particular. Just come back a page to Genesis chapter 10, because we have a clue as to who's behind this city and this Tower of Babel. You see, Genesis 11 isn't the first occurrence to this city of Babel. In fact, there are only two occurrences of the word Babel. The first is back here in Genesis 10 and verse 10. We read, "The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar." So we have the same city of Babel and we have the same land of Shinar. Now the question is, whose kingdom is this kingdom of Babel? Well, the answer is in verse 8. "And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel." And so now we're introduced to this man, Nimrod. He's the great-grandson of Noah. He's the founder of this empire, this kingdom of Babel. Now there's only 3 verses dedicated to this man, and yet there's a surprising amount of detail that we have an insight of who this man really was. For example, you'll notice in these 3 verses here dedicated to him, that 3 times we're told that he is a mighty man, a mighty one on the earth, and a mighty hunter before the Lord. So the record's telling us that this Nimrod was no ordinary man. Let me read you a summary of the state of the world before the flood. I mentioned this before. Genesis 6 verse 4. "There were giants in the earth in those days. The same became mighty men, which were of old men of renown. And what's more, God sees the wickedness of man, that it was great in the earth." And of course, God responds by flooding the world to rid this spirit of greatness, this idea of being mighty, this idea of rebelling against God, this idea of focusing on human achievement. And yet after the flood, what do we find but that Nimrod is bringing back and reviving this spirit of being mighty against God? Because that's exactly what it says there in Genesis 10 and verse 8. Nimrod, well, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. This was before God. It's repeated twice for emphasis. And of course, the literal Hebrew there is in the face of God, in defiance of God. Once again, it's a repeat of history. It's the same expression used before of the flood. The earth was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. And so it's not so much that Nimrod was a hunter of wild animals. I think he's more than that, because he was filling the earth with violence. He was a hunter of people in the idea of building his empire, his kingdom of Babel. It's the same expression used in Jeremiah 16. He was a hunter of people, and he was filling the earth with violence. This is a commentary from Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews. He writes this: "It was Nimrod who excited these people to such an affront and contempt of God. He gradually changed his government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power." So Nimrod's political agenda was to exercise this control over his subjects. As Josephus says, he would rule with fear and tyranny. This was the sort of person that he was. And this Nimrod had global ambitions. He was an empire builder. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel in the land of Shinar. That's the first time that word kingdom is used in the Bible. And really that's quite telling because, this isn't a kingdom that God set up. This is a kingdom that's in opposition to God. And so there would be kings of Shinar from that time onwards. And each of these kings, they would aspire to the same ideals of Nimrod himself. Now, if you've got a Bible like mine, you'll notice in the margin that word Babel can also be translated Babylon. They're the same city, the same place with the same interchangeable name. And so I want you to keep that association between Babel and Babylon in mind. Because as we trace this story through the Bible, the tower, the city, the ideologies of Babel, they continue in the city, in the ideology, in the religion of Babylon through history. You see, what began in Babel continues in Babylon. So what was the problem with this Tower of Babel? Surely building a city in a tower isn't such a big deal. Well, we read in verse 5 that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do." And God's estimation of the situation is this: now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And so God, for the second time, makes the observation that now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And I say that was the second time because God had already concluded after the flood that the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. And so the story of Babel is really an analogy. It's a story of human nature. This is what mankind will do if left to themselves. And so really there were two problems with this tower: the problem of rebellion against God and the problem of an alternate religion to God. Now I want to read you a reference from Obadiah 1. This isn't specifically speaking of Babel, but it's going to describe how pride can cause people to act. Obadiah 1 verses 3 and 4 says this: "The pride of thine heart hath deceived thee. Thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, Who shall bring me down to the ground? Though I'd exalt myself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord." It's the same language, it's the same boast of Genesis 11. It's what Obadiah describes as the pride of heart which deceives. You see, pride was the real issue. And this is what Josephus, again, notes about Nimrod. He says this: Nimrod persuaded his followers not to ascribe it to God, as though it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. And the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And so not only does Nimrod want to lead a rebellion against God, he wants to replace God. Man doesn't need to submit to God. Man can find happiness and purpose in life without God, says Nimrod. It's the start of this humanistic way of thinking. This is the political agenda of Nimrod, and the first thing on his list is to rebel against God. And so he makes this city of Babel the center of his political power. But then he went further than that. He wasn't just content with setting himself up as a political figure, a king, an empire builder. He wanted more than that. And so he turns to religion. He wants to build a temple to be the center of his religious worship. Now, interestingly, archaeologists and historians have identified what sort of building this Tower of Babel was. It was what was known as a Babylonian ziggurat. It was a Babylonian temple. And most agree that this Tower of Babel corresponds to the Etmeninki ziggurat. It was the largest of all Babylonian ziggurats. And its name had an interesting meaning. It meant the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. And that was because, after all, these ziggurats were said to be divine abodes, the place where heaven and earth joined. And so if you happened by chance to wander past one of these ziggurats back in the day, you would notice that it was a huge pyramid-shaped building, typically having 7 terraces in the form of steps layered on top of each other. And there were 25 bronze gates on each side, 100 in total. And at the top was a temple shrine, regarded as the very entrance to heaven, the gateway to the gods themselves. So this wasn't a tower for admiring Middle Eastern sunsets. This was a temple associated with religious worship, built to worship the Babylonian gods. You see, this was the religious agenda of Nimrod. First, rebel against God. Second, set up an alternate religion, replace God. So what was the outcome? How does God react to this challenge made by Nimrod? Well, in verse 7, God says, "Go to, let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." Now, I want you to notice the play on words here. In verse 4, they build a tower to come up into heaven. And so God comes down from heaven in verse 5. They said, "Let us go up," in verse 3. And so God says, "Okay, we'll come down," in verse 7. There's a deliberate play on words here, you see. And then we read in verse 8, "So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence, upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore the name of it is called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth." So here's the question. Why didn't God just flood the earth as he had done so previously? Well, it's because in Genesis 9, God had promised, "Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth." And so God first confuses their language, and then he scatters them as he originally intended. No longer were they of this one language, one speech, unity of verse 1. And so they're divided. Those speaking the same language naturally mix together. Now, just to see the extent of this, just cast your eyes back to Genesis chapter 10. I want you to notice the repeated phrase used over and over again. Verse 5, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after his families in their nations." Verse 20, the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. Verse 31, the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. And verse 32, these are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. And so the tower was never finished. But here's the thing. This city, this tower, this empire, this ideology, everything it represented of rebelling against God, of replacing God, well, that's going to continue. So let me show you how this comes about. I want you to come across to Daniel chapter 1. We can trace this Tower of Babel through the Bible by following some of its key identifiers, and particularly that phrase, the land of Shinar. About 1,500 years later, we get to the time of Daniel. And so we read in Daniel 1 and verse 1, it was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Then notice what it says in verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar. That's our phrase, the land of Shinar. And this king of Babylon brings those vessels to the house of his God. And it's repeated there again for emphasis. He brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So we're immediately met with a contrast. There's a comparison between the house of God and the treasure house of Nebuchadnezzar's God. And in that house of Nebuchadnezzar's God just so happens to be, well, it's in this land of Shinar. We're specifically told that in verse 2. So what's the record telling us? Well, it's telling us that now we have, well, another king of Babylon in this same land of Shinar, in Nimrod's kingdom of Babel. And this Nebuchadnezzar has, well, he has a temple. This is the religion that Nimrod started way back in Genesis 10 and 11, and yet it's alive and well and flourishing by the time we get to Daniel chapter 1. Well, that's not all, because if you happen to be an astute Babylonian citizen living in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, you would know that Nebuchadnezzar had a number of building projects that he worked on in his spare time. And in particular, he set about reconstructing a certain tower. Now, the fascinating thing is that archaeologists have found a plaque written by Nebuchadnezzar himself. And the inscription on that plaque says this: the ziggurat of Babylon, the tower, the eternal house. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar writes: I have completed its magnificence. I built it and I finished it. And he sounds quite proud of himself. I have highly exalted its head with bricks covered in copper. This edifice, the house of the 7 lights of the earth, the most ancient monument of Babylon. A former king built it, but he did not complete its head. Since a remote time, people had abandoned it without order expressing their words. Well, I set my hand to finish it and to exalt its head, as it had been in ancient days, so I'd exalted its summit, says Nebuchadnezzar. So here we have Nebuchadnezzar restoring this temple, completing this Tower of Babel. And he calls it the most ancient monument of Babylon. It was the oldest building because, well, it had its roots way back in Genesis 10. And so Nebuchadnezzar, well, he boasts that unlike the former king who was able to complete it, only he, Nebuchadnezzar himself, was able to finish it. This is the pride, this is the ambition of this Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. But that's not all, because Nebuchadnezzar, we find, sets out actively to continue the legacy of Nimrod. You see, in Genesis 11, they said, well, let's make a tower, let's make a temple. And of course, that's the same temple which Nebuchadnezzar brings the vessels to the house of his God. In Genesis 11, they had brick for stone and slime for mortar. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar takes things seriously, using the same materials as he writes on that plaque. In Genesis 11, of course, the tower was incomplete. They left off building. But Nebuchadnezzar, well, he boasts in the completion of that tower. I set my hand to finish it, he says. And you remember that way back in Genesis 11, the people were scattered because they no longer spoke the same language. And what do we find? But that Nebuchadnezzar sets about reversing that. What does he do? He brings people from different languages, different countries, and people from around the earth, and he teaches them the learning and the one tongue of the Chaldeans. This is Nebuchadnezzar going step by step out of his way to reverse the curse of Genesis 11. This is Nebuchadnezzar continuing the spirit of Babel. So how does God respond? Well, this is God's response in Isaiah 14. For thou, Nebuchadnezzar, hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell. Prepare slaughter for his children for the iniquities of their fathers, that they do not rise nor possess the land, nor fill the world with cities. Well, that's what Nimrod started. For I will rise up against them, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will cut off from Babylon the name. Or wasn't the Tower of Babel all about building a name? And so what do we find in history? But in 478 BC, Xerxes, king of Persia, he destroys Nebuchadnezzar's Tower of Babel, and it falls into disrepair. Well, that was until the time of Alexander the Great in 331 BC. Alexander the Great starts transporting some of these bricks of the tower to a different location, but inconveniently his early death stops his plans for that. Now, you might think that's the end of the story, but the curious thing is that it isn't. I'm going to suggest that the Bible is going to tell us that the spirit of Babel and what it represents still exists today. This is a famous painting by a chap named Bruegel. He decides one day to paint this Tower of Babel, but he lefts off the top of that tower. He puts it in incomplete form to show the confusion of language and the scattering of the people. Now, what's the significance of that painting? We'll come forward a couple of years to 1999, and you'll notice that the main Parliament building of the European Union in Strasbourg has an uncanny similarity to that painting. So why is that? Why would the European Union tell their architect to copy Bruegel's painting? Well, just think about what the European Union is all about. They're all for a free Europe without borders, yet bound by social, economic, and security alliances. Even the word union indicates what Europe really wants. They want a united European Union. Now, is that too much of a stretch? Well, here's a poster promoting that unification of Europe. And the selling point on that poster just so happens to be the slogan, Europe, many tongues, one voice. This isn't mere coincidence. This is, well, it's the spirit of Genesis 11, a group of united people having one voice, having one purpose. Now, I want you to come across to Daniel chapter 2. Normally we'd spend an entire evening on this subject, but just to give you a summary of Daniel chapter 2, all we have is this Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, given a dream of world empires that would come after him. And so we read of that dream in verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest and beheld a great image. This image head was of fine gold, his breasts and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. And we're told the interpretation of that dream in verse 37. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power and strength and glory. End of verse 38, thou art this head of gold, and after thee shall arise another kingdom. And so history tells us that after the empire of Babylon fell, well, we had the Medo-Persian Empire, then the Greek Empire, then the Roman Empire. But when we get to verse 41, there's a curious emphasis on the feet and toes of the image. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, that kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it the strength of the iron. Verse 42, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so shall that kingdom be partly strong and partly broken. And as Bible students, we would say and suggest that this last empire, this feet and toes of that image, well, that corresponds to the European Union of today. Having many tongues and yet united in this ideal of a Europe without borders, having one voice, as it were. A shaky foundation of clay, and yet one that's bound by this iron religion and this ideology of Babel. And so although the ancient city of Babylon had fallen, the spirit of Babel from the days of Nimrod, well, that continued. It continued past Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. It continued through the image empires of Daniel 2. And it continued into the European Union that we have today. Now, I want to give you one more reference showing this European Union. So come with me to Revelation 17. Now, Revelation is, of course, a book of symbology, and it deserves an evening or several evenings to do it justice. But I just want you to appreciate the ideas we've considering so far with this Babel or Babylon that's going to continue right through to the final book of the Bible. And so we read in Revelation 17 and verse 5, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great. So this is the context of the chapter. This is all about Babylon. This is what the chapter's on. Then come to verse 12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest, well, they're 10 kings. Verse 13, these 10 kingdoms, they have one mind, and they're going to give their power and their strength unto the beast. So in verses 12 and 13, we have 10 kings or 10 kingdoms or 10 nations, you could say. And these individual nations, well, they're going to give up their autonomy. They're going to give up their nationalistic identity to have, as it says there, one mind. And in verse 15, you notice that these kingdoms are made up of, well, they're made up of people and multitudes and nations and tongues. Now, if that in any way sounds familiar, well, that's what God scattered way back in Genesis 11. And yet here in Revelation 17, these scattered people, these multitudes, these nations, they're uniting together in this same spirit. They're forming the feet and the toes of Daniel 2. They're the European Union of today. So if that's the continuation of that Tower of Babel, then what happens next? Well, the Bible leaves us in no doubt as to what happens next. The Bible is going to beautifully show the complete reversal of this Tower of Babel. Everything that Nimrod set up will be reversed and replaced by God's own kingdom. We need to notice how God describes this. You see, instead of the one language and the people that Nimrod wanted for his empire, in Zephaniah 3 we're told that God intends man to have only one pure or common language to praise and worship him. And God intends to fill his kingdom with people who've been redeemed. They've been called out from all kindreds, nations, and languages, as it says there in Revelation 5. And in contrast to building the city in the Tower of Babel, well, God intends man to be what the Bible describes as a spiritual house, builded together for the habitation of God in Ephesians 2. And while in contrast to making a name in self-promotion, God intends that his own kingdom will be filled with people who walk in his name, that follow his character in Micah chapter 5. And just as the kingdom of Babel was always in opposition, it was always challenging God, well, God intends that only his kingdom will stand forever, which shall never be destroyed in Daniel chapter 2. And so that means, of course, that there is only one king over the earth, and that all people and nations, well, they're going to go up year by year to the one centre of worship in Jerusalem. You see, this is the complete reversal and the removal of the Tower of Babel. It's replaced by the purpose of God. And this is, of course, shown in one language, one people, one spiritual building, one name, one kingdom, one king, and one center of worship. This is the future that God's planned, and He invites you and I to be part of that future. Now just come back, if you will, to Genesis chapter 11. I've been saying over and over again that the story of the Tower of Babel is one of contrast. And I want to leave you with one final contrast that God wants us to understand. He wants us to understand this final contrast because He's going to leave us with a choice as to whether or not we learn the lesson from the past. So back in Genesis 11, just as He did with Noah, well, God's going to start again, as it were, and outwork His purpose with another man. It's in the same chapter here. We're introduced to this man in Genesis 11 and verse 31. And Terah took Abram, or Abraham as he became known, his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees. Now, Chaldea is a region within Babylon. And so here we have a man who's called out of Babylon, you could say. He's been called out of this land of Shinar, out of the empire that Nimrod founded. And for the rest of the book of Genesis, well, that's going to be all about how God will work with this man Abraham and with his family throughout the remainder of Genesis. So there's a contrast there, you see. But I want to show you now a contrast between the two cities. Because, well, Abraham comes out of a city that's very much like Babel. This Ur of the Chaldees, well, that had all the idolatry, the superstition, the religious worship, the temples that Babylon or Babel had. And God asked him to leave all of that behind and to come into a land which he had never seen. And the thing is, Abraham did just that. And of course, that took real faith to do that. As it says in Hebrews 11, Abraham looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. This is the complete opposite to Nimrod, who built a city and a tower to replace any need for God. And rather than, well, replenishing the earth, these people didn't want to scatter and fill the earth as God intended. They wanted permanency. They wanted fixed dwellings. They wanted to dwell in a city which they themselves had built. What about Abraham? Well, we're told that by faith, Abraham left the permanency of Ur, and he would sojourn in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. The contrast couldn't be any clearer. Abraham had no city. He had no permanent dwelling place. In fact, so much so that when it came to bearing his wife, he would say this in Genesis 23. He says, I'm a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a bearing place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Let me give you another contrast. Babylonians were very much into their stargazing and their astronomy. Matthew 2 tells us that there were Babylonian wise men who came from the east because they had studied the stars. And one of the constellations that all good Babylonians would know about was a group of stars that looked like, well, a mighty hunter in the sky. And that sounds a bit similar to the words of Genesis 10. Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And so every time the Babylonians looked up and they saw this constellation of stars, well, they were reminded of Nimrod himself, the founder of their empire. And this is, by the way, what the Greeks later called Orion, that constellation we know today. But in contrast to this, just listen to the words of Genesis 15. God brought Abraham forth and he said, Look now towards heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them, so shall thy seed be. And so when Abraham looks into that sky, he didn't just see these scattered stars steeped in Babylonian superstition. God wanted him to see more than that. And so he would see these stars typifying God's purpose with his natural and his spiritual descendants. And then there's a contrast of names. Nimrod sought to make a name for himself. He wanted a reputation. He wanted an empire, and so he built cities, and he named them for himself. And of course, in Genesis 12, 2 and 3, God promises this to Abraham. He says, I'll make of thee a great nation. I'll bless thee. I'll make thy name great. Thou shalt be a blessing, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This is the complete opposite of those who said, let us build a city and a tower. Let us make us a name. You see, Abraham never sought a name for himself. And because of that, he was blessed, and God gave him a great name. Now, you might be wondering, why am I labouring this point between Nimrod and between Abraham? Well, that's because the Bible leaves us with a choice. We can either choose to be on the side of Nimrod, or we can choose to be on the side of Abraham. Because Romans 8 says that, like Abraham, we've been called according to the purpose of God. 1 Peter 2 and Hebrews 11 tells us that, like Abraham, we are to be strangers and pilgrims in this earth, confessing that the world has nothing to offer us because God has offered us something better. And so, like Abraham, we have a different citizenship. We desire to be citizens of a city and a kingdom which God has prepared for us. And if we do this, then Galatians 3 says that, well, we can be heirs according to the promise given to Abraham. And what's more, Daniel 12 describes us as shining as the stars forever and ever. And just as Abraham never saw a name for himself, but was given a name by God, what do we find? But that God is calling people out to bear his name in Acts 15. And like Abraham, we are offered salvation and blessing through the name of Jesus. This is the contrast that the Bible makes between these two men, these two sides. And this contrast becomes a choice. The choice that the Bible offers you and I, we can either choose the side of Nimrod or we can choose the side of Abraham. And if we choose the side of Abraham, then God can work with us just as he worked with Abraham. So what can we learn from the past? Well, I want you to leave you with two lessons that we can learn from the Bible's record of this Tower of Babel. I want you to come, if you will, to Isaiah 55. The first lesson we have from this Tower of Babel is that God's purpose is greater than whatever man might imagine. Look at what God says in Isaiah 55 and verse 6. He says this, "Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near." Why? "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." You see, the Tower of Babel was fundamentally a story of human nature, a story of towering ambition of man to rebel against God. And not only rebel against God, but to replace God. They sought to build a tower that would reach the heights of heaven, as it were. That was their purpose. But notice what God says of his purpose in verse 11. "My word, my purpose shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it will prosper in the thing whereto I sent it." So the first lesson we can take from the story of Babel is that despite man's efforts to challenge God, despite all of that, God's thoughts and his ways remain far higher and greater than whatever man can imagine or dare to challenge. You know, as we live in a world of uncertainty, in a world of war, in a world of ambition, a world of human achievement, surely that gives us comfort that God's purpose is never in doubt. What he's promised, he will accomplish, as it says in Isaiah 55. And the second lesson I think we can take from the story of Babel is found a couple of pages later in Isaiah 66. In Isaiah 66 and verse 1, God says this, "Thus saith the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Verse 2, for all those things hath my hand made, and all those things hath been, saith the Lord. But to this man will I look, even to him that is of a poor and a contrite spirit, and trembleth at my word. So God looks to those who are humble and who show humility. Now I want you to keep that in mind and come back to Daniel 4. Because what we're going to find here, we've used a fair few chapters of Daniel. What we're going to find in Daniel 4 is that even Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who built this or rebuilt that Tower of Babel, he would ironically learn this lesson of pride and humility before God. Look what he says in Daniel 4 and verse 29. At the end of 12 months, this Nebuchadnezzar walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. And the king spake, and he said, Is this not great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, and for the honour of my majesty? It's the spirit of Genesis 11, isn't it? It's all about let us build us a city and a tower, and let us make us a name. Well, what happens next? Verse 31, while the word was yet in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And the same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar. This is history on repeat. Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as the next Nimrod to challenge God, to oppose God. And he boasted he's completed this tower that had never been completed. And yet in all his pride, God humbles him to the very lowest point it would seem. He's made to eat grass, and he does this for 7 years. Until we get to verse 34. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High. And I praised and I honoured him that liveth for ever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and whose kingdom is from generation to generation. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honour the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment. And notice what he says next. Those that walk in pride, this God of heaven is able to abase. What a change from the one who rebuilt this Tower of Babel, no less. And so the second lesson from the story of Babel is a lesson of pride and humility. As Nebuchadnezzar learnt to his cost, those that walk in pride, the God of heaven is able to abase. But the very moment we humble ourselves, in that very moment, God is able to work with us. He's waiting for us to approach him in humility. Whereas Isaiah 66 says, God looks to those that are of a humble and a contrite spirit.